Romans 14, Unplugged, Feasts and Fasts and Food, oh my. And since we've been on a 2-week break, some of what we're going to be talking about tonight will be review. Remember, I've got a commentary that's available at my website at tatesaitorah.com. And from the top of my website, there is a cluster of links there, and you can see the Romans 14 is right there. If you click on it, it'll bring you to this page, and you can scroll down into the commentary. There's a written version that is available, and I'm creating the YouTube videos as we go along. In fact, this video that I'm creating, that's a video that you're watching right now, is part of the creation. So if you're interested in watching the videos, you'll have to go over to my YouTube channel and catch them there, or you can watch them from my website here. If you click on the where is it? The YouTube videos right there. There's a link that has all the videos parked on one page as well. You can watch them straight from my website. All right, but let's jump now into the study. Let me just give you kind of the overview for those of you either new to the study or we've been on a 2-week break. Your mind's been on the festivals and you can't remember what Torah teacher Ariel has been talking about for the last, I don't know, several months. What's going on with Romans 14 Unplugged? In a nutshell, basically, I have come to understand that the prevailing, preferred, popular Christian perspective on Romans 14 is a passage where Paul is admonishing Christians and Jews, but mostly Christians, Gentile Christians, to settle their differences with one another. And in this settlement, we have Messianic Jews. This is according to the popular Christian position. We have Messianic Jews who are still trying to hold on to a Torah-based lifestyle even after coming to faith in Jesus as Messiah. So they want to keep Torah, but the Gentile Christians in Paul's readership, they haven't come from a Torah-based lifestyle. This is according to Christian commentaries that I read, that you can pick up in the Christian bookstore or read online or things like that, or you listen to your average sermon that's taught in a Christian church. This is the perspective I'm describing. And so because there are these differences, sharp differences that sometimes divide one another, Paul wants the two groups to come together and stop quarreling and judging one another. But what this means is that the Gentile Christian group, which is referred to as the strong, they need to understand that they're no longer really obligated to keep any semblance of obedience to Torah anyway. They're working from this understanding that the law has been set aside now that Jesus has come. To use Paul's own terminology, we're not under the law, we're under grace, like he says earlier in Romans. And borrowing from the themes that are found in the book of Galatians, we find that it's not the works of the law that can save anyone. It's only faith in Messiah. And so therefore, using Jesus' own words in Matthew chapter 5, Jesus says, I came to fulfill it. I came to fulfill the law. And so our standard and traditional historical understanding of this passage and Paul's writings as a whole leads us to a conclusion that even though there are people in the world who are named Messianic Jews or Messianic communities, Messianic Jews and Gentiles, and they claim that keeping Torah is something that's relevant for them, we in mainstream Christianity, evangelical Christianity, Catholic Christianity, Orthodox Greek Christianity, and all of the varying denominations that are found around the world, predominantly the viewpoint that we have been handed and that we've come to understand is that the law is not something that we need to concern ourselves with, at least not the ceremonial and the civil. We of course still hold to the moral, right? Thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not commit adultery, thou shalt not lie, thou shalt not steal, those types of things, we hold to those. But the ceremonies such as Sabbaths, keeping kosher, wearing tzitzit, putting mezuzah on your door, walking in the festivals, all of those other ceremonial type things, those are really either for Jews only, that is to say Israel, or they've been fulfilled by Jesus so that we don't have to do them. They were shadows pointing to something that was greater. And so to move into all of that is to go backwards in our faith. And so that's kind of the, you could say, the approach that we enter into the discussion here at Romans 14 with from a traditional Christian perspective. The weak in faith that Paul talks about, let me just jump, if you look at the first verse in Romans 14, it says, as for the one who's weak in faith, welcome him, but not to quarrel over opinions. The person who's weak in faith, the astenunta te piste, as we see here in the Greek, right? We could read this here. Ton de astenunta te piste pras lambaneste me eis diakristes dialegismon. Paul is talking about these people who are weak in their faith, astenunta te piste, and the traditional Christian perspective is that the weak in faith is the Messianic Jewish element or constituency within our largely Gentile Christian churches. I'm talking about first century congregations, by the way. And these Jewish people, they love Yeshua, they love God, but they still have this proclivity and preference for keeping Torah. And so what do we do with them? And perhaps maybe it's because they're weak in their experience with Jesus, right? They're baby Christians, as we would call it today. Or it could be that they're just so used to keeping the Torah because that's how they're raised as Jews, to keep Torah. And so the bottom line is, we who are strong, right, the strong Christians, we need to kind of make concessions for the weak in faith that are in our group, but we know that we ourselves don't have to follow after those. So, are you understanding more or less the background that we typically approach this passage with? And this sounds very cordial. It sounds very accommodating. It sounds very convincing, to be honest with you. But as a Messianic Jew, let me just tell you my understanding of the passage, and then we'll jump right into my study. And this is based on my own study along with others. I'm not the only one who holds this perspective that I'm about to describe to you. It's held by other many well-meaning Christians in communities today. But the overview is that, firstly, my understanding of this passage is that the weak in faith are not actually Messianic Jews. They're actually non-Christ believing Jews. They are Jewish, but they are Jews who have been raised with a faith in God and a loyalty to Torah, but they haven't yet become convinced that Jesus is the Messiah that they read about in their Tanakh. So they're in dialogue with Christians, with Gentile Christians in their communities. You remember the Gentile Christians were visiting the synagogues. You go back and read through the book of Acts. And Paul certainly spoke in the synagogues of his day. You know, this is before the hard break between Judaism and Christianity that we had in the following centuries. So in Paul's day, we still had a lot of interaction between the Jewish community and the Christian community. But the weak in faith, in my understanding, would have been Jews who were weak in their faith in Messiah. But they were open to the idea. They weren't hostile to it like Jewish people are today, like the anti-missionaries are poisoning their minds to turn away from Jesus of the Bible. The Jewish people in Paul's day, many of them, not all of them, but many of them were open to the idea that Jesus was the long-awaited Messiah that they study about. So I think they are the weak in faith. And the message that Paul's trying to get across, of course, yes, it's not to judge one another. That part is true. I'm just scrolling down to my passage so we can get ready. Paul does not want them to judge one another. This is true. But at the same time, it's not necessary to insert into Paul's letter the assumption that Paul thought that the law was abrogated or uplifted or done away with or superseded by the law of Christ or something like that. Indeed, the bulk of passages that Paul would have interacted with from the Tanakh and the theology that's carried along from the Torah through the Tanakh and into the time period of the Apostolic Scriptures, the New Testament, would have given Paul the understanding that the law of Moses was not done away with in Jesus, but rather it was brought to a more sure footing. It was brought to a stronger application, but more on the inside than the outside. The focus wasn't so much external, rather the relationship with God had taken on a new meaning. Thus, there are numerous prophecies in the Tanakh that tell of corporate Israel one day accepting their Messiah, Yeshua, being brought into a right relationship with God, only to be turned around and being filled with the Holy Spirit so that they can actually walk out the Torah of Moshe the way they were supposed to walk it out. So the radical change is not in the doing away of the Torah. The radical change in the New Testament is the change of the old man into the new man, the regenerative birth of Israel, of a Jewish person, so that rather than keeping the Torah superficially under his own power, He is now actually walking into the Torah as a spirit-filled Christian Jew, as a Christian, as a Messianic, as one empowered by the Spirit of God to be pleasing to God and to walk in newness of life and forgiveness of his fellow man. And so that's the perspective I believe that Paul would have been working from. What is more, Paul confesses his own dependency and continued observance of Torah commandments, his desire to keep festivals. He traveled in and around the diaspora areas, and when possible, he'd like to go back to Jerusalem to keep the feasts. And when he was asked about his position on keeping the Torah, Acts chapter 21, he demonstrated by his actions that he was a lifelong Torah keeper. He confessed that he's never done anything against his people, or against the law of Moses, or against the customs of his people. And so he's not a lawbreaker, he's a law keeper. And so we need to really rethink the way we have cast Paul for the last 1900 to 2000 years or so. And thankfully, there are many communities around the world, Christian and Jewish, that are rethinking Paul, giving him his own voice once again, beginning to realize that Paul didn't have anything bad to say about Torah observance per se. He had bad things to say about legalism, and he had bad things to say about what we term nationalism, or what I like to term ethnocentric Jewish exclusivism. The idea that the Torah is for Jews only, and that my Jewish identity is what brings me into a right relationship with God. And so Paul had bad things to say about that perspective of the Bible. But he really had nothing bad to say about keeping the Torah from a spirit-led position, as long as you're understanding that it's not your Torah keeping that's saving you or earning you brownie points before God or anything like that. So, and he also went to great lengths to explain that the Torah is not a Jewish exclusive document. It's not for Jews only. It was given to Israel to caretake, to safeguard it, but it was meant to be shared with anyone who would join themselves and become part of remnant Israel and join themselves to Israel at the remnant level, thus taking on the covenant relationship of the body of Messiah, aka the remnant of Israel. Remember, and I'll say this before, and then I'll just jump right into my study. In order to understand the scriptures better, from Paul's perspective, Israel is comprised of Jews and Gentiles in Messiah. It's also still comprised of unbelieving Jews, but that's the national Israel part that Paul's seeking to witness to and bring into a relationship through Yeshua, into a relationship with God one day. So we'll talk about that as time goes on. But for those of you who have just joined me in my studies or are just picking up where I left off, let's turn now to Romans 14. We've been really looking at just verses 2 through 4. Let me just conclude with where we were going with that. Let me see. Did I lose my no? All right. So let me read just 2 through 4 of those verses, and then we'll jump into Tim Haig's commentary. He's a Messianic Jewish author that we've been borrowing the notes from. And the question we've been asking for this section, and we will finish this section tonight so that we can jump down into the next question, are Christians free to worship God any day of the week? We'll start that next week. And that covers verses 5 through 9 of Romans 14. But for now, the question is, what is the contrast between anything and vegetables? On my screen right now, you see I've got the ESV over on the left and the SBLG&T on the right. And the English has, one person believes he may eat anything, while the weak person, right? Remember, the weak is this same person that we read in verse 1, this asthenon. We're going to see it here, right here in the Greek. One person believes he made anything, while the weak person, right? We've been asking who is the weak person and what is the contrast between anything and vegetables. Does he mean anything as in we can eat anything non-kosher? Does it mean it's okay to eat pork? Does Paul mean now that it's okay to eat shellfish, shrimp, lobster, crabs, clams, octopus, squid, mouse, tarantula, camel, whatever you want to eat, giraffe? Just trying to trick you there. Giraffe is actually kosher, but all the other things I just mentioned aren't. So what does he mean by anything? Or is he talking about anything that the Torah prescribes, right? Leviticus chapter 11, Deuteronomy chapter 14. So that's really what we've been looking at. And we've been using a little bit of the Greek to see hasmin pistue fagin pantaha de astenon lakanta estie is what it says in the Greek right there, verse 2. Let not the one, in verse 3, let not the one who eats despise the one who abstains, and let not the one who abstains pass judgment on the one who eats, for God has welcomed him. Ha estion ton me estianta, me estioneto, ha de me estion, ton estianta, me crineto ha theoscar al ton praselabito. That's the Greek over on the right side of the screen. And then verse 4, says, who are you to pass judgment on the servant of another, right? So we got the two people judging one another. It's before his own master that he stands or falls, and he will be upheld, for the Lord is able to make him stand, regardless of whether you're eating things which the Torah prescribes or you're only keeping a vegetarian diet. God is going to accept you one way or the other. The Greek says, "Sutis e hakrinon, alatrion oika tein ta idio kurio steke e pipte statesete de dunate gara hakuria stesai auton." And when we turn to Tim Haig's commentary, we're going to see that there's some Greek that bears relevance as we look at it. Maybe we can better understand who the weak person are, who these weak people are, and what's the contrast between anything in the vegetables. And we looked at 2 weeks ago. You have to go back and listen to show number 112 in the previous shows. I believe that the contrast here is not between a kosher diet versus a vegetarian diet. I don't think that's what Paul's referring to. I think instead what he's trying to challenge us with is that the Torah outlines what is acceptable for food and what's not acceptable for consumption of food in Leviticus chapter 11, as well as there's a smaller repetitive list in Deuteronomy chapter 14, but Leviticus 11 is the major kosher or kashrut listing. And Paul would have upheld that list. So when he says anything here in the Greek, or in the English, he's not talking about anything that you can put into your mouth. He's actually, and let's turn to Tim Haig now, and so we can see this, he's actually talking about something that would have been acceptable from a Torah-based standard, but you're choosing to launch into a vegetarian diet. So let's look at some of this. Tim Haig talked about this. We picked up this commentary last week. I don't think I need to read all of this, but we are going to finish these last two paragraphs. But last week, let me just read maybe this last sentence here. And let me start right there. Paul says, this is Tim Haig, while Paul clearly taught the need to establish the Torah, right? Remember Romans 3:31. He was not concerned to establish all the rulings of certain sages, even if they did represent the majority opinion. He was no doubt concerned that such a position would hinder the inclusion of the non-Jews as they strove to become full-fledged participants in the Jewish community of faith. So from Paul's perspective, he believes that both Jew and Gentile in his day should receive Torah. They should be walking into Torah. They should be keeping Torah. But number one, not for the purpose of being saved, not for the purpose of earning brownie points, not for the purpose of showing that you're a better ethnic group than the other or anything like that. Torah simply defines the lifestyle of redeemed covenant community member. It's the blueprint for living. It's the right way in which to walk out your lifestyle because God deems this the right way to live. And the Torah being a document that is written for Jews and Gentiles who are in covenant with God, or anyone who's in covenant with God, then it becomes a document that's available for Jews to keep as well as Gentiles to keep. So he doesn't have to uproot Torah in order for him to admonish those who are keeping a vegetarian diet versus those who are not vegetarian to stop quarreling with one another. Tim Haig goes on to conclude in this paragraph starting right here. One should also note how the two parties, the Jews and Gentiles in this passage, are described in these verses by the apostle. One person has faith that he may eat all things, but one who is weak eats vegetables only. Here, those willing to eat meat, that is all things, right? Those who are not vegetarian, are described as having faith. And the Greek says, hosmen pistue phagein panta. Literally, Tim Haig says this would be described as, on the one hand, he who is believing to eat all things, while in comparison, the phrase, those who are weak, the ha de astenon, which reminds us of what we read about earlier in verse 1, the weak in faith, the ton de astenunta, te piste, this must be understood as referring to the same people. So verse 1 and verse 2 are the same crowd, even though he doesn't use the same Greek. Right, he leaves off some phrases. In verse 1, he calls them weak in faith, right? The full Greek phrase, ton de astenunta te piste, the ones who are weak in faith. But in verse 2, he kind of uses shorthand. He says the ones who are weak, right? He leaves off the part about weak in faith. But by context, we see they're the same people. That's the point that Tim Haig's trying to bring up. But also notice that in the Greek, what's interesting, Haig says, is that he who is believing, right, the group that are strong, incorporates what we call in Greek a present indicative present indicative verb, while the weak uses a different type of verb known as a participle. And remember, in case you're not versed in Greek, the Greek language has many different moods and tenses and things like that, and voices, and it's a little more elastic than I think the English or even the Hebrew. But in the different tenses that we find in Greek, the present tense is one of the more popular tenses that we find throughout the New Testament. It's the predominant verb tense that's used, and it simply means, just like it sounds, present tense. It's something that's either continuous or it's ongoing. Sometimes it's undefined, but it's continually present. The continuous present can be defined as kind of using a participle, like it's ongoing, ing, walking or standing or eating or speaking or something like that, and so, or believing, like in this verse. And when we bring in the indicative mood, the indicative simply brings in an aspect of the verb that conveys something that is certain, something that is sure. It indicates, as the name sounds, indicative. And so I said all that to say it's the only verb that can actually give a designation of time of all the other moods, the subjunctive, the optative, the imperative, and things like that, the 4 different moods. And so Paul's simply using one of the more popular moods to indicate, as Tim Hegg says, perhaps the reality that this is who you are in Messiah. You are those who have faith. As Tim Hegg says, what might this suggest? It could be that the use of the present indicative points to a specific, or at the top of the page here, specific confession of faith, i.e. confessing Yeshua as Messiah. The strong, they are presently indicated by their believing in Jesus. That's what we might say by the present indicative verb there. While the participle of the weak in faith, right? This sounds kind of odd because it's not a present indicative, it's a participle. It describes a present characteristic, right? The ing participle, but it is a different type of verb. It perhaps points to a condition of weakness which the apostle considers to be current. Notice it's got an ing aspect to it, but it's not necessarily permanent. That is to say, the comparison is Paul would describe believers as currently believers, presently believers, right? Present indicative, but this is something that doesn't change. Their state of being saved doesn't fluctuate, right? It doesn't change from day to day. It's something that took place at a definitive time in their history, in their past, and they are presently still in a state of being saved. Present indicative. But by comparison, by simply using a lesser type of verb, the indicative, the participle, for the weak in faith, he's perhaps allowing, from a technical perspective, allowing for the weak in faith to actually change their status from one day to the next. So presently they're weak. Remember, I think weak means undecided when it comes to who Jesus is. So presently they're weak, they're undecided as to Jesus being the Messiah, but that could change as they continue to dialogue with Christians in their group and make a profession of faith. So presently they're weak, but they don't have to stay weak. So currently weak, but not necessarily permanent. Those weak in faith were viewed, Tim Hegg says, by the apostles, those still in the process of declaring their faith in Yeshua. I think we'll stop right there with Tim Hegg's commentary because I don't want to get too technical, but the bottom line is there are other ways to interpret this passage, and we certainly have the Greek to support other perspectives of this passage. We don't always have to default and say that the weak in faith are those who keep Torah, as if keeping Torah as a Christian is a sign of weakness. That's really, as I mentioned, the prevailing Christian perspective that doesn't sit too well with many Messianic Jews, myself included, although I'm not openly offended. I'm just wondering how we can arrive at the perspective given the preponderance of scriptures in the Tanakh that teach that keeping Torah as one filled with the Spirit is a sign of strength, not a sign of weaknesses, not a sign of weakness. Paul himself he's considered one of the strong, right? Read Romans 15:1. He is one of the strong, yet he kept Torah. And the prophecies point towards Israel keeping Torah one day as they're filled with the Spirit. So to describe a person as weak because they believe in Jesus plus Torah is a very, in my opinion, it's a very weak argument, pun intended. All right.